Understanding China has never been more important and more difficult. Taksha latest executive capsule course, Watching China, is an all virtual course that will help you decode China's politics and policies. Learn about the party state structure, ideology, and policy drivers. Master the language of Communist Party discourse and open source research. The course is perfect for professionals, journalists, students, or anyone curious about the Asian giant. Sign up now on the link in the description to start understanding China like never before.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Rakshith, a research analyst at Takshashila Institution, and joining us today is Lauri Myllyvirta. Lauri is a co-founder and a lead analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, CREA, an independent research organization headquartered in Finland. He's also a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He has worked for the past decade as an energy analyst covering climate, energy, and air pollution issues across Asia, and was based in Beijing from 2015 to 2019. His research has focused on China's coal consumption and CO2 emission trends, sources of air pollution, as well as the development of the country's coal-fired power and steel industry. And today, our conversation will address several of these issues. Welcome, Lauri. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much, Rakshith. It's great to be here.
Right. So my first question to you, Lauri, is about China's dual carbon goals, which state that it will reach carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. And there are a lot of experts who believe that China might have already peaked its carbon emissions in 2024. Do you believe the same? And if so, what specific factors do you believe are critical in determining whether China's CO2 emissions have truly peaked?
Thank you. So a year ago, or more than a year ago, I was one of the first to say that China's emissions are likely to peak, and that was based above all on the massive increase in the deployment of clean energy. Solar and wind, first and foremost, that started a couple of years ago. China was doing a lot already before, but the growth in the past few years has been just staggering. So that clean energy deployment reached a scale where it can conceivably cover all of the growth in electricity demand. However, last year, 2024, electricity demand continued at an exceptionally high rate. So a GDP growth will probably come in around 5% when it's published, and electricity demand has been growing at 7% still last year. And that 7% growth rate was still too high even for those massive wind and solar additions to meet. So China's emissions will probably have inched up a bit last year, less than 1%. And the outlook, I think, is now that they've plateaued, but there isn't, at least yet, a clear structural falling trend. So for that to happen, either energy demand and electricity demand growth will have to slow down to more typical historical rates, or the clean energy additions will have to speed up even further, which will happen this year, but the outlook after this year is slightly more uncertain.
Right. And given the recent redefinition of energy intensity, which focuses on fossil fuels and not necessarily renewable energies, how do you assess the implications of this shift of the term for China's long-term climate commitments? Do you believe that this change reflects a strategic recalibration of priorities, or does it indicate a deeper systemic issue within China's energy policy framework?
Right. So what happened is back in 2020 when Xi Jinping announced the goal of reaching carbon neutrality and also brought forward the timeline of peaking emissions from by 2030 to before 2030. The initial ideas that he was communicating about how to go about this were emphasizing quite a bit the control of total energy consumption, control of high energy, high emitting projects, so building more capacity in energy intensive industries and so on, controlling that building and so on. And there was definitely a shift over the following year or two from those ideas to an approach that emphasizes a massive scale up of the manufacturing of clean energy technologies, a massive scale up of the deployment of those clean energy technologies, and much less emphasis on controlling total energy consumption. And so the thing that happened is that during the COVID pandemic, the zero COVID policy, China's economic growth became much more energy intensive. Before that, China's economic structure had been shifting towards less energy intensive sectors, consumption, services, and so on. And that trend reversed during zero COVID. So that meant that even as GDP growth continued pretty much at the rates or even a bit below the rates before the pandemic, energy consumption growth accelerated. And it became clear that China is not going to meet the target during this 5-year period out to 2025 for energy intensity. So there was a short-term need to come up with some kind of a fix that makes it easier to meet the target, or at least makes the shortfall, the miss, less yawning against the target. And so simply redefining what is meant by energy intensity was I'll say a sneaky way of doing that. So China said that instead of looking at the energy intensity of GDP, we're only going to look at the fossil energy intensity. And because China is adding a lot of clean energy capacity, then it's easier to meet such a target if you use the same number, but you define the target differently. But yeah, so it reflects both this short-term kind of a face-saving measure, and also it does reflect a change in how China's policymakers are approaching the whole project of peaking and declining emissions towards carbon neutrality. And so the third thing that I'll mention is obviously to basically hit the economic targets that China's policymakers have under the zero COVID. They just had to release the controls that they had on energy consumption, because the only way that you could hit those GDP goals while so much of the economy was affected by zero COVID was to catalyze massive growth in manufacturing industries.
And Lauri, what factors made China's economy more energy intensive post pandemic? Why did it happen?
Right. So if you think about the sectors that were affected by the pandemic controls, it's obviously the service industries. So those service industries that require people to go somewhere in person, like restaurants and hotels and so on, are obviously going to be affected in an unavoidable way. But also China's economic policy response strengthened that impact a lot. Basically, every other country in the world focused on income transfers to households, job security, and so on, to try and shore up the spending power of households. Whereas what China did was cutting costs for industries and businesses, reducing electricity bills, reducing taxes, increasing all kinds of support and subsidies, while in fact cutting wages and so on, which then then reduced spending power but increased supply. And so what happened globally is that suddenly a lot of people in the world were sitting at home with money from the government, and China was churning out stuff, and Chinese consumers didn't have the money to buy it. So then that led to an incredible export. And those export industries and the manufacturing industries for the domestic market that got stimulated are much more energy intensive than the sectors that got hit by the drop in household spending. So that kind of a shift in the structure of the economy, the composition of the economy, is what led to this massive increase in energy consumption.
Wow, that's really interesting. Clearly, this industry is really important for China, right? I mean, clean energy was one of the largest drivers of its economy in 2023, particularly the new three that it defines as solar power, battery, and EVs, uh, which emerged as an important source of growth in China's exports in the same year. Um, but a lot of noise out there claims that, the United States and the European tariffs will have a huge dent in China's clean tech exports. How valid is this argument?
If you look at the role of the US alone as an importer of China's clean energy technology, it's very small, and the perception is greatly exaggerated. So, of course, given especially Trump's theatrics and in general the fact that everything that happens in the US gets disproportionate attention in the world, it's understandable, but the US is very small. So if we look at the whole market for solar power, for example, the US is only 7% of the world in terms of the amount of annually installed solar power equipment. And given that the vast majority of that equipment is made in China, then that also shows you how small the US is as a market for China's solar industry. So that and this is an industry where output has been growing at double digits, obviously, every year. So then that's not much to worry about. So yeah, there's been an exaggerated perception of how significant the US and even the EU is for those clean energy industries. And if you look at the past years, what has happened is that the massive increase in supply from China of solar panels, of EVs, has found its way to a lot of developing and emerging country markets, and the export destinations have become a lot more diverse. So that has made the industries much less vulnerable to tariffs from both the US and the EU. We estimate that last year, almost half of China's exports of solar, wind, and EV technology went to the global south, so developing and emerging countries.
Hmm. And it's happening the same with the agriculture imports too. When it comes to China's agriculture imports, and it started diversifying its imports since 2018, and it's the share of US has reduced a lot, and other developing countries share, and special, and also Brazil is now a huge exporter of agriculture goods. So clearly seeing that trend in many of the sectors. So let's move to artificial intelligence and data center, and the entire narrative of energy consumption revolving around it. I believe that a lot of narratives out there linking electricity demand growth to artificial intelligence and data centers have been blown out of proportion. The recent report by International Energy Agency states that the data centers currently consumes about 1 to 2% of global electricity, and is expected to rise modestly to 5% by 2030. What's your take on that?
That's obviously, in terms of numbers, that's correct. And this is again something where the disproportionate tension on the US has created a bit of a distorted image. And if you think about the US, you've had stable or very slowly increasing demand for electricity. So then when you have a new sector that is adding to that electricity consumption, it seems dramatic, and it can upend plans and projections and so on. And it's the same for Europe and obviously for individual states in the US. For some European countries, those additions are significant if you get a lot of data centers located there. But yeah, globally, the picture is exactly what you described. That it's a small, very small share of growth, and that's especially true of China, where of course there's a lot of investment in AI and data centers, but also there is massive growth in electricity demand from all the boring, ordinary industries. So in that scale, it remains tiny. So when I've just seen this, when every time I speak to journalists or post on social media, there are always questions about this. So I've just sensed that it's gotten blown out of all proportion. So I just did some back of the envelope calculations of how many GPUs are being manufactured in the world, and if you just run all of them red hot 24/7, how much power is that going to need, and got an upper limit for what it could do. So in that sense, I was confident that this isn't going to be a global game changer in terms of electricity demand projections. But still, of course, if you think 20 years out or 10 years out, there's of course a lot of uncertainty. Currently, we're in a phase in the hype cycle where AI is supposed to do everything and fix everything. So if you think about it getting integrated everywhere and generating queries out of everything that happens in the world, there's no upper limit over the slightly longer term. But the reality is that when the demand for computing power has grown, the energy efficiency of the gear has gotten a lot better as well. And the other thing that's going to happen is because those models are going to be very expensive to run. If you run all the video feeds and all the other possible input from the world through them, you're going to have to just create much more specialized models rather than using these general purpose models that have been trained on the entire internet to process those inputs. So all of that is just going to limit the increases in power demand.
Exactly. I completely agree with the last point you made. A lot of narratives out there does not include the energy efficiency of AI related computer chips, which actually doubled approximately every 2.5 years, 2-3 years. With the current chips that we are using now, using 99% less power for the same calculations compared to 2008 models. So I think that's a really interesting and important point to consider when we do these debates.
Absolutely, yeah. If you just think back to 1990s, where embedding an 8-bit image on a website was the most data-intensive thing that you could do. If you told someone from that era that everyone's going to be watching HD videos on mobile devices all over the world, they would probably estimate that we would use the entire electricity consumption of the world many times over for that. So it's good to have that perspective.
Right. Moving on to nationally determined contributions, the deadline for countries to submit their updated NDCs, which will include targets for 2035, is set for February 2025. Currently, China's existing NDCs includes targets to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, right? It's dual carbon goals. It also includes a commitment to lower carbon intensity by over 65% from 2005 levels by 2030. And please correct me if I'm wrong with the figures. And to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption to around 25% by the same year. What is your assessment that China will and should come out with its 3.0 NDC, if I can call it? And how can it achieve those targets by building on existing trends and policies?
Thank you. So, first of all, my sense is that there are still pretty profound conversations taking place in China about what the NDC should do. So it might be that it takes a bit longer. We'll see about that. And if it does, I'm not sure that it's a bad thing, because that would leave a bit more time for engagement between China and the other those big emitters that do want to work on climate. But anyway, in terms of the next NDC, the really important thing is, okay, China has this CO2 peaking commitment, and then there's the very long term commitment of reaching carbon neutrality before 2060. But the pathway that China takes between those two goals, what happens over the 3 decades that separate those two targets, is incredibly important. If China follows a trajectory of okay, emissions plateau, start to come down a tiny bit, but they remain high until late 2030s, until 2040s, and then the steep emission reductions needed to get to carbon neutrality are postponed afterwards, then that means that the total emissions, cumulative emissions from China, will be enormous and way too high to reconcile with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It also means that the credibility of the target would be very weak, because if you say that, yes, you're going to do this in the long term, but you just can't be bothered over the next decade or two, then why would you then find the motivation afterwards? So 2035 is the first year for which China is going to set emission targets after the peak, and that's going to set the base for the emission reductions towards the carbon neutrality goal. So that's incredibly important. That said, China is currently badly off track to its 2025 targets, and even the 2030 target for reducing carbon intensity is going to be challenging because of the rapid rise in energy demand over the past few years. So simply reinforcing the commitment to reduce carbon intensity by more than 65% by 2030 would mean that emissions in 2030 would have to be at or below their 2023 level, which is already starting to be meaningful. We think what China could achieve by 2030 is an about 10% reduction in emissions. The two big opportunities for emission reductions this decade and out to 2035 in China are the power sector, obviously, where you have this tremendous growth in solar and wind, and now also nuclear, which is new projects are starting to come through, and then in steel. What's happening in China is that steel production, steel demand has started to plateau, or has actually plateaued since 2020. And at the same time, the availability of scrap to be recycled into steel instead of using the primary route of making pig iron, using coal, and so on, is increasing rapidly. And so when you have plateauing or slightly declining demand, and you have this increase in availability of scrap, that creates an opportunity for a very significant reduction in emissions by more than 30% by 2035 from steel making. So having targets for those two, setting targets for renewable energy or non-fossil energy capacity that are in line with the current rate of additions, 300 gigawatts per year of wind and solar and so on. And then setting a target for clean steel would go a very long way. Then if you had those two in the bag, then you could set very meaningful targets for total emissions as well. But currently the concern is that the thinking in the Chinese government seems quite conservative on those total emission targets. So I'm a bit more optimistic towards some of those sectoral commitments, especially commitments on clean energy that could be made than having a really meaningful target for total emissions in 2035.
But Lauri, it sounds very nice to hear that these countries install this much of gigawatts capacity. Like China surpassed 1,200 gigawatts capacity last year. But how real solution this is to fix the problem? I mean, I know they have a massive grid capacity problem. Most of the installed capacity that we're talking about does not generate power. It's just the install capacity. And how do they see to fix this power grid problem where they can actually run these power into the electricity grid? Because India itself is facing this issue where whatever installed capacity we have, we cannot send it to the electricity grids because it's not modernized enough. So does China have the same problem?
Right, that's a slightly exaggerated description of the problem. So what's been happening in China is that yes, there has been the issue of so-called curtailment. So the situations happen where wind or solar plants could generate, but it can't be fed to the grid. But in the past few years, that's been a few percent of the potential output of wind and solar has been lost because of those grid constraints. That's not nothing. It's significant for the developers of projects because obviously it's not a uniform 3% across all plants. Some plants are affected by much more than that. And if you're a developer and your project profitability metrics and so on are based on assuming a certain generation, and then there's 10% less generation, and let's say your profit margin is 10%, then that means that your profits are completely gone, right? So it creates risks for the financiers and developers of projects, and that's why when you hear from those people, it sounds like it's a really serious problem, and it is for them. But if you think simply in terms of the energy balances of the country, it has stayed at a level where it hasn't affected things that much. In China, the problem first emerged about 10 years ago when wind and solar capacity was a fraction of what it is now. And then, especially from 2017 to now, the country managed to bring down those rates of curtailment significantly, so that while capacity increased by a lot, so that tells you that it's not a case that nothing has been done about the constraints in the grid. There has been a lot of work, a lot of improvement, a lot of pressure from the central government. So the government basically told provinces that if you don't bring curtailment rates below 5%, then you're not going to be allowed to go ahead with new wind and solar projects. And provinces like those projects because they bring in investment, they bring in tax revenue, they bring in GDP, employment, everything. So that was a strong incentive for them to fix things. The fundamental challenge is that integrating a lot of wind and solar into the grid means that coal-fired power plants, which are the dominant form of generation in both China and India, have to run in a much more flexible way. Right. They have to adjust their output down when there's a lot of supply from solar and wind, and in both countries, most power plants run at a fixed tariff, so they get the same amount of money for every unit they generate. And so those plants have no incentive to operate in a flexible way. They're just in a space where the more you run, the more revenue you make, and changing that is really confronting that interest from the coal power industry, and changing the incentives is really the big obstacle. It appears to me that in the past couple of months in China, curtailment has gone up. Unreported curtailment has gone up, and the reason for that seems to be that power demand growth was lower, so there was less space on the market, and coal plants failed to adjust the output down when needed. So the problem seems to be emerging once again. But so this is really an ongoing fight between different interests.
Mhm. That's a really interesting insight about the variable pay incentives that these existing power plants need to have in place to let in wind and solar energy. I mean, it's the first time I'm hearing it, so really cool. Let's finally, my last question to you is on India, because I know CREA's India team does an amazing job when it comes to working on air pollution and putting out outputs out there. But I personally believe there are two contrasting narratives about India's air pollution. The first is a story of progress based on government data, as we have seen recently from the National Clean Air Program (NCAP), which shows that many cities have reduced pollution levels, right? But the second story, based on scientific analysis of satellite data, reveals the sources of air pollution, such as vehicles and factories, are actually increasing. The NCAP was launched in 2019 with the goal of curbing air pollution in India, and it involved a large financial commitment from the central government or the union government. The initial target was to reduce PM10 and PM2.5 pollutants by 20 to 30% by 2024. However, in 2022, the program shifted its focus to PM10, just like China actually changed its definition of energy intensity, with a more ambitious reduction target of 40% by 2026. Uh, and they did not include PM2.5. Now, this change, along with the additional weightage to dust from construction and roads, created an incentive for Indian cities to focus on controlling dust rather than the more dangerous PM2.5 particles, which actually penetrate deeper into your lungs and do much more damage, right? I mean, it just says that the government is doing the easier job first. But my question to you is, how can we actually work on reducing the PM2.5 particles, and what could be done to shift focus back to the more dangerous pollutants?
Thank you, and so I'm still happy to see that at least some progress is happening. I remember the skepticism in Delhi, in so many other places a decade ago. So it's important to make note that progress is possible. India's managed to put in place a lot of air quality monitoring, which was also lacking not so long ago, and so on. So it's possible to make progress. But yeah, you're right. I've been concerned, and we at CREA have been concerned by the focus on cities and urban areas, and putting the onus on individual cities to tackle the problem. That's exactly what we saw in Beijing and in China as well. So it was a few large cities that were trying to tackle the problem on their own, while the surrounding areas were increasing pollution from industries, from power plants, from other sectors, and that created a dynamic where you could achieve some short-term improvements, like for Beijing Olympics in 2008, but systemic reductions towards actually safe levels were remained elusive. And so in China, the breakthrough was creating three what were called key control regions around Beijing, around Shanghai, and around the south in the Guangdong province. And those control regions were large. They were several hundred kilometers across and covered all the sectors, all the industries. In those areas, policies were introduced. Their first emission standards were more stringent. Emission standard enforcement was more stringent in those areas. And then those policies were also rolled out in the rest of the country. And so I think that regional focus is the thing that would be really important to introduce in India as well, especially, of course, the Indo-Gangetic Line. That really is one airshed. It's staggering when you look at it from the satellite. When you have a smoke that just stretches all the way across northern India, and just looking at that really makes it clear that there's no way for individual cities to reach clean air without addressing all the major emission sources in their airshed.
Right. Thank you for that, Lauri. And thank you for answering all the questions so brilliantly. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and we truly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I think it was a good conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Too. It was great. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and see you all in the next episode of All Things Policy. I'll attach all of Lauri's readings and insights on the same issues in the description below. Please go ahead and do give it a read. And thank you again for tuning in to All Things Policy.
Thank you, Rakshith. Thank you, everyone.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.